Stephen Cohen. I'm responsible for special events at the Mirowitz Center, and I am delighted to welcome my colleague and my friend, Dr. Diane Everman, who's coming to speak with us about the Jewish community of St. Louis, 1890 to 1929. Dr. Everman is currently the archivist for the Holocaust Museum, as well as the St. Louis Jewish Community Archives. She earned her BA and her MA from Oklahoma State University, and she has her PhD from the University of Maryland, College Park. She has served as the archivist for several projects, including the Richard Gephardt Congressional Papers at the Missouri Historical Society, and established archives for the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis and the Taylor Family Enterprise Holdings Inc. Corporate Archives, a position she still currently holds. She has worked in ethical archaeology and currently is working on projects in the northern Negev in Israel, as well as a survey project in Pompeii, Italy. It's my delight to welcome you and thank you for joining us, Diane.
All right, give me a second here and I'll get my screen going. There we go. Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I want to just give you a little bit of a background of why I chose this particular time period for the book. In part because it is one of the best that we have in terms of photographs. If you're familiar with Arcadia Publishing, the press that published the book, they do all kinds of books about local history, about neighborhoods, of various topics. And they're the ones who actually approached me to do the book. And they wanted it to be all St. Louis Jewish community history from day one to the present. And I said that that just wasn't possible in a book that had a restricted page number and image number. So I decided on this particular time period because it was probably the most transitional in St. Louis history and in the community's history. Immigration was starting to change. A lot of people from Southern and Eastern Europe, they were much more Orthodox than the Jewish community that had been in St. Louis for 100 years before then. They also mostly spoke languages that weren't common in St. Louis at the time. Lots of Russians came into St. Louis at the time. It was also an interesting period in which there was the urban-suburban division starting to happen. St. Louis was expanding beyond its original location, and so you will see in some of the photographs, especially of the synagogues, that places that were downtown then were gradually moving west. And finally, it was also an interesting time for women because women were starting to play a greater role, not only in the community itself, but also in civic and national endeavors. So we'll get started. The book is divided up into various topics. The first one is family. And you can see here a Jewish family in St. Louis. These are why your photographs, your personal photographs, are so important. This is a fabulous image of a family at an outing in Forest Park. That's the World's Fair Pavilion behind them. And you could pretty much date this photograph, not only from their clothing, but because the World's Fair Pavilion wasn't actually built for the World's Fair. It was built for, in 1910, as a result of funds that were gained by the city from the St. Louis World's Fair in 2004. This is a wonderful picture. I love these kind of images. So, I mentioned that there was this change in number of people and the types of people who were coming into St. Louis, but you can't ignore the people who were already here. And it included a gentleman by the name of J.D. Goldman. J.D., also known as Jake, had been a Jewish Confederate soldier from the Carolinas, I believe. He made his money in store chains in Arkansas and then moved to St. Louis, which is very common for individuals for that time period who came right after the Civil War. When he got to St. Louis, he made his more money in the cotton industry. And in 1899, he decided that people like him, members of the Jewish community who were of new wealth, had a difficult time already getting into certain neighborhoods. And so he bought a tract of land in what was now the Central West End and established Hortense Place. And Hortense Place was named after his daughter who had recently died. Her name obviously was Hortense. And he reserved lot number 9 for himself and had this home built. Now, this is very unusual for what a lot of people were experiencing at this time, but I wanted to show you this because this house still exists on Hortense Place. So you can still go by and see it. And I apologize for the fuzziness of some of these images. These are not mine, actually. These are from the History Museum. But I wanted to show you the interior of Jake Goldman's house, which was quite something. It had the latest of everything new and modern. It had electric lights. It had indoor plumbing. If you can see on the lower left, it even had a third floor ballroom so that he could have parties up there. So this is one aspect of St. Louis Jewish community at the time in the late 1890s, early 20th century. But most people didn't really live like this. I'd like to introduce you to the Greensfelder family. If you'll notice, I'm not including a lot of famous names in this presentation because I wanted to introduce you to regular people that you might not be familiar with. So Moses B. and Cary B. Levy Greensfelder were quite an interesting couple in the fact that when he was about 30 years old, Moses, who was a prominent businessman, had what we would today probably call a breakdown and left his business and decided that he needed to get back to an easier way of life. So he bought a farm on Olive Street Road and decided that he would commit himself to farming and gardening. But that didn't last very long because he decided what he really wanted to be was a philosopher. So even in his 60s, he was taking courses at the University of Chicago and at Cornell, and leaving most of the running of the farm to his wife, Cary. As you can see on the right, she would sell tomatoes and various produce. But they were sort of the normal sort of working class, at least non-industrial working class that existed at the time. Their children, however, went on to great things. One son was a lawyer, one was a doctor, and their daughter was actually one of the earliest female lawyers in the state of Missouri in 1909. Now, this is how a lot of people lived in this time period in St. Louis. These are tenements that existed down in closer to the river. Obviously, a big change from J.D. Goldman's house on Hortense Place. Tenements were for the housing choice, actually for many, their only choice for the poor and the working class families, especially Jewish families and new immigrants. In the early 20th century, there was a law that was passed in St. Louis because these buildings were so hazardous that they limited them to 3 stories. And you can see how rickety some of them were built. You can imagine if they were more than 3 stories. The biggest problem that these areas had was sanitation. A lot of them had communal water sources. All of them had communal toilet sources. That image on the right was actually a 12-family flat. If you can imagine 12 families living in that. There was a decision by the city in the late 1900, 1910, something like that, that they decided to do an investigation of the ghetto area in St. Louis. That's the area that today is around Biddle and Carr, if you're familiar with that area. And one of the things that they wanted to focus on was sanitation, and it made national news because of the horrendous things that the inspectors found. People selling baked goods, for example, where people had to actually reach across the trash middens to get the bread out of the windows from the person who was selling it. You know, all kinds of horrible things, especially in terms of the outhouses that caused people problem. Unfortunately, this did not change a lot until the 1930s. But you can also see why a lot of people, when they did make any type of money, that they started moving west. I love this photograph. Unfortunately, it's not mine. It's for the archives. It's actually from the Library of Congress. But these young boys are actually St. Louisans. This is a Louis Hine photograph from 1910. And Hine did an expose on child labor. And these young boys are among the ones that he photographed. There's such a fabulous looking lot. They were also very troubled. This is a Russian family. The Slines were a Russian family who moved to St. Louis in 1904. Unfortunately, their father really didn't like being in St. Louis, and he didn't like being in the US. And so he actually abandoned the family and went back to Russia, which meant that the mother of the family had a very tough time, and so did the boys. So most of them did odd jobs. They were newsboys. They did various things, including, unfortunately, some theft. They got into a lot of trouble. They were sent, all of them were sent to the Industrial Reform School in St. Louis. There are actually 5 brothers. One of them, at the time that Hine took this image, one of them was in the Reform School, so he didn't get his picture taken. So we've got here Meyer, Abe. Louis is the one who was in Reform School, Max and Sam. The oldest one, Meyer, was in the papers a lot because he had a tendency to like to pinch people's wallets, including his teacher's wallet from his classroom. But he decided when the First World War broke out that he wanted to serve. And I think it was a way to get away from St. Louis, and that was probably true of many of these young people. He served in the Philippines. He served in Siberia. If you didn't know that the Americans had troops in Siberia in World War I, surprise. He stayed in, he served in Hawaii and the Panama Canal Zone, and he even signed up to serve in World War II, but obviously did not because he was older at the time. But there were lots of these kids in these families that existed in St. Louis at the time. So I don't actually know where this photo was taken. I love the photo though, because the little guy in the center on the first row looks like he wants to be in the mafia. But what's most striking about this image is if you notice those Sam Brown belts that some of the kids are wearing. If you're a certain age, you know about safety patrols, and maybe you were even a safety patrol at the time. And in the 1920s, the AAA, or the American Automobile Association, created the safety patrol program. And they did that because of the increase in the number of cars and thus the number of accidents and the hazards that pedestrians were facing on the streets, especially school kids, because most of them actually walked to school. So they started the safety patrol program so that older children could help younger ones get to their school and get there safely. These little kids are so cute. So I'm going to show you just a few of the synagogues that existed at the time, and especially the ones that I think have some really striking architecture. And this is one of them. This is Sher Emeth when it was at 17th and Pine. And it's such a shame to me that this building no longer exists because it's fantastic. Cher Emmett was here from about 1869 to 1896. And you can see that it's just this magnificent building along this street, but the street lacks a little something like paving. United Hebrew was another congregation that existed in St. Louis during this time period, and I apologize for the faintness of the image on the left. This was United Hebrew at 21st and Locust. This was they were there from 1880 to 1903. The one on the right, you're probably more familiar with. This is United Hebrew that was on Skinker across from Forest Park. I believe this was a 1920s structure. What you might not know about this building is that when UH decided that they wanted to build a synagogue here, the neighborhood went up in arms. There were legal cases, many legal cases against allowing the community to establish a synagogue in this area. They didn't want them. They didn't want the crowd. They didn't want a Jewish synagogue there. And this case went all the way to the Missouri Supreme Court before it was settled and overruled the neighborhood petitions and allowed UH to build this structure there. It's now, if you do research with the Missouri Historical Society, it's their library and research center. Fabulous acoustics. Temple Israel. TI has a very interesting past, and talk about colorful characters. Rabbi Sonnenschein was one of the ones who established Temple Israel when he broke from Cher Emmett because of his, some would say, unorthodox ideas. The image on the left is actually Leffingwell and Pine from the 1880s. And the one on the right, you probably are more familiar with. This is Temple Israel on Holy Corners on Kings Highway. It's still a religious building. If you're familiar with A.E. Hotchner, the author who wrote about growing up during the Depression in St. Louis, it was at the gymnasium in this building, not the one with colonnades, but the one next to it, that he played basketball in. So if you've read his book, this is the structure that he's talking about. B'nai El, the oldest synagogue west of the Mississippi was founded by B'nai El in the 1850s. And the one on the left, sorry for the bad image, but there aren't really many images except drawings of this building. It was octagonal, very interesting structure, built at 6th and Surrey. And if you go to see the Cardinals play, and there are all those parking lots between Busch Stadium and Broadway, this is the area where this synagogue existed. Many people called it the pepper grinder or the pepper shaker because of its unusual octagonal shape. The one on the right is it's B'nai El's third location. I believe this one was on Del Mar. As far as education goes, a lot of the Jewish community actually attended St. Louis public schools in this time period. This happens to be Clinton School in the Soulard area. And one of the little girls in here is Rosa Spitz, and she was the daughter of Rabbi Moritz Spitz of B'nai El. And she and her classmates are pictured here. You can see that they're in class number 8. Interesting, in around 1907, about the same time that the city was investigating the tenements, they also wanted to find out where Jewish children were going to school, which schools had the largest Jewish population. So they conducted a survey and found that there were 7 schools that had a high Jewish population in them, and they were almost all in what we would call the ghetto area, as well as Midtown. So all the way up to almost Grand in that area were the heavily Jewish era student population in 1907. This is also the time of, as I mentioned earlier, that women were starting to get very much involved in things. And this happens to be an image from the Mothers Congress that took place. It was the National Women's Congress. They also met with a new organization called the PTA, the Parent Teachers Association. And the woman in the front that's sort of turned, it's marked with an X underneath it, is Leah Leonard, Oscar Leonard's wife. And to many of you, that name probably doesn't mean anything, except that Oscar Leonard was the head of the Jewish Educational and Charitable Association, which was one of the precursors to the Jewish Federation at the time. And he and his wife were very much involved in things that dealt with not only the community itself, but the community's role in the larger St. Louis and Missouri population. And you can't talk about the Jewish community in St. Louis without talking about business and industry. And this building on the right that has the big banner on the top of it that says Grand Leader was Sticks, Bear and Fuller's flagship store in St. Louis. Sticks, Bear and Fuller, those names are synonymous with early 20th century business in the area. They came into the area about 1892 is when they went into business together. But in 1906, they built this building on Washington between 6th and 7th. And it took up the whole block. This building for St. Louis is sort of like, I don't know, Macy's in New York or various other department stores in London. It was the first of its kind in St. Louis, and they wanted it to be spectacular. You can see it's multi-stories. Each story had a different area that they dealt with, whether it was home furnishings or women's clothing or whatever it was. And it represents a big change in business, at least this kind of mercantile business in St. Louis, and obviously done by the Jewish community. And if any of you have heard me speak before, you've often probably heard me mention the name Will Levy. I think I even mentioned him earlier today, and I'm going to mention him later on also. He's probably the most prominent architect in St. Louis that you've never heard of. Jewish, he came from New Orleans, and family settled in the St. Louis area. He didn't actually have any academic architectural training. He spent a year or so working for an architectural company, and then in 1892 struck out on his own. He actually designed hundreds of buildings in St. Louis, institutions, homes, a doghouse. I have a plan for a doghouse. He was involved in baseball. He built a lot of things for Sportsman's Park. He's the one who designed the lighting for Sportsman's Park. He designed things for the Cardinals and the Browns. And I chose 2 of the buildings here. The one on the bottom is Dink's Parish Laundry. And if you know Midtown very well, this is near Pappy's Barbecue and the St. Louis University in that area. And the building is noticeable because it has this incredible terracotta design on the front of it. And that design was actually created by Will Levy. Now, he didn't build the original building for Dinks Parish Laundry that was built on this site, but he did the renovation and the look that it has now. He also did the Rinskopf building that on Delmar, and it too has that sort of very stately look to it. It has a lot of decorative terracotta on the front of it. And I will be mentioning Will later on also because he was very prominent in building things within the community and for the larger St. Louis community. Related to Will Levy, actually, is Jacob Mahler. That's the dashing man up on the left. And Mahler was the dance instructor extraordinaire in St. Louis. Mahler's ballroom that still exists in St. Louis is his, also designed by Will Levy, I might add. Earlier on, he had a lovely building that he had built specifically as a dance studio in Midtown, right by near the Fox Theater in that area. And he taught a lot of St. Louis youth how to dance. He had a Saturday morning club for children, and that's what you can see there is the large photograph. Anybody who wanted to be anybody in St. Louis took dance lessons from Jacob Mahler, even private parties. He has a dance step named after him. He was the master of ceremonies for the mask and pageant and for the VP balls. Of note, not Jewish, but Vincent Price took dance lessons from Jacob Mahler when he was a boy. One of my favorite businesses promotional piece that we have in the collections is this from Rothschild Brothers hat company. The center part of this actually spins so that you can actually put different heads under different hats. It's a fabulous promotional piece, but they were on Washington, and again, a multi-story building, and their claim to fame, supposedly, was that they were the largest distributor of hats in the world. 2 floors of hats, and the 3rd floor was just of gloves. Supposedly, they had 1,600 different styles of fur hats alone. Dewaskin Fancy Grocery, lots and lots of small grocery stores that existed in St. Louis, many of them run by Jewish families. After I did the book, I was talking with Bob Cohn, the editor emeritus of the Jewish Light, and he said, "Oh, you've got a picture of my mom in your book." And I said, "What?" And he pointed out that the little girl in this picture is his mother. This is Lillian Dewaskin Cohn and her family's grocery store. This was actually on Franklin Street. At least it was in the 1920s. I keep saying that these are one of my favorite photographs, but this group of photographs is among my favorite. This is from the Cook Carriage Company. And Julius and Oscar Cook came from the Boot Heel of Missouri. They weren't doing well down there, and there are not a lot of members of the Jewish community. They don't have a very large Jewish community in the Boot Heel, so they came to St. Louis and they started this carriage company. It was state of the art. Now, it doesn't look like it necessarily from modern eyes or through modern eyes, but they took Henry Ford's idea of an assembly line and applied it to the building of carriages. Julius and Oscar, started buying up other carriage companies so that they would become larger and larger and have less competition. And they even got motor cars. But each one of these they took photographs of their business so that they could show the different steps that were done. One group would build the frame, one group would do the upholstery. Unfortunately, Julius died suddenly in 1903, and his wife took over the running of the business with her brother-in-law. The other interesting thing about Cook Carriage Company is that they hired a lot of immigrants, especially recent immigrants, and they hired a lot of women into the business. The Modern View started around in 1901 and lasted for almost 50 years in St. Louis. And it was the modern voice for the St. Louis Jewish community. Now, there were newspapers like the Jewish Voice, and later on there would be the Jewish Light. But this sort of fills sort of that in-between time. And it's sort of a cross between what I usually tell people, if those of us of a certain age remember Time or Life magazine, for example, and a newspaper. It covered local, national, and international news, but it had a modern format. So instead of it looking like a newspaper, it looked more like a magazine. It had lots of photographs. And if you're interested in doing genealogy or looking up things associated with the Jewish community in that 1900 to about 1950 time period, this is a place I would strongly recommend that you look. The St. Louis Public Library has hard copies of all of the issues. The county library has microfilm. But most recently, the county library allowed the newspapers.com to add their holdings, which was on microfilm, to the newspapers.com website. So you can actually search this now online. Unfortunately, it's not all of them, but it's a large part of them, and it's a great source of information for the community at the time. So civic involvement, we recently had the celebration of the women's right to vote. And this is an example of that here in St. Louis. And you can see that somebody actually wrote on the photograph. Please don't do that if you have these great photographs. But you know that it's part of the suffrage movement, and Oscar Leonard was one of the speakers. We think this took it says circa 1918, but after talking with the people at the old courthouse, which is where this photo was taken, we think this is probably the 1914 women's rally that took place here in St. Louis. In that year, St. Louis the citizens of St. Louis were voting on a referendum to allow women the right to vote. Unfortunately, it did not go very well. It did not pass in 1914. There was only one ward in St. Louis where the men of St. Louis thought that the women should get the vote. Things changed later, though. When I first came to the Jewish Community Archives, one of the first collections that I processed was of Marcus Bernheimer. And it's a very small collection, but it has such amazing items in it. Marcus Bernheimer was also a Jewish Confederate from Mississippi, came to St. Louis, and unlike, say, Jake Goldman, who made his money in cotton, Marcus Bernheimer made his money in flour. So much so that he entered his flour in the Chicago World's Fair in 1896 and won a silver medal, and then won a gold medal for his flour in the St. Louis World's Fair, the Louisiana Exposition in 2004. And if you go down onto the landing near the river, you actually see a sign that marks where Marcus Bernheimer's business was in the early 20th century. He also was quite an entrepreneur. He was involved in all kinds of organizations. He was president of HIAS here. He was head of United Hebrew Charities. He was the creator of the Merrimack Highlands, which was a resort area right outside of town. And then in 1910, he decided to get involved in politics and run for office here. And he was elected circuit court clerk for St. Louis. These people look so very happy in this photograph. And I actually had to, when I first found this photograph, I had no idea what the YPSL was. But it was the Young People's Socialist League. And very prominent in the 19-teens, especially here in St. Louis. And these were non-Zionists labor group. Now, I've heard from the children of some of the people pictured in this image that their parents actually were in it for the socializing, but their real goal was to really work for the working class in St. Louis, especially those people who fit that bill of not living like Jake Goldman and others, but living in those tenements and really trying to pass a 40-hour work week, to allow unionization, to have some labor protections. They fell out, not only out of favor, but many people left the organization in the 1920s when the Communist Party, the American Communist Party, started taking over labor concerns in not only the U.S. as a whole, but certainly even in St. Louis. This lovely lady is Sadie Fraley, and you can tell by her dress there that she was a debutante here. Her father, Moses Fraley, was an alderman here. He was one of the founders of Temple Israel. He was very much involved in the community, both the Jewish community and the St. Louis community. So she also married into the Sticks family. So she was definitely of that non-working class group. But like many women of the time period, Sadie became very much involved in what we would call social reform and just civic involvement organizations. She was part of the Jewish Convalescent Home. She was one of the major fundraisers for it. Of course, her position in life allowed her to do that. But she was also part of, later on, the Missouri Council of Defense during World War I. So again, that idea of women becoming involved more and more in not only the Jewish community, but the St. Louis community. This lovely lady is Rose Tucholsky Jonas. Her father, Dr. Herman Tucholsky, very prominent physician at the Jewish hospital. Her husband, Ernest Jonas, was also a physician. Rose was a free thinker, and she was definitely against war. So she was a prominent member of the peace movement that existed in the early 20th century, certainly before World War I. She was a charter member of the International League for Peace. She was a member of the St. Louis Civil Liberties Union. She was a member of the Jewish Women's Peace Committee. In part, I think, because she really was against war, but I think it was also in part because starting in 1914, both her father and her husband were starting to have a lot of blowback from being German, in at least in her father's case, German American. But her husband in 1914 was not yet a naturalized citizen. And he was getting a lot of pressure, as was the Jewish hospital, to not allow Germans, especially those who were not naturalized, to not only serve in the hospital, but to deal with patients. So when the US entered the war in the things were building up in 17, but definitely in 1918, her husband was actually dismissed from the Jewish hospital because of being German, and he lost all of his patients. I think that's part of what motivated her, but I think in part she was also just against settling things through war. And speaking of war, I want to introduce you to two members of the Jewish community who served in the war. The gentleman on the left is Samuel Morgenstern, and he was born in Russia, became a naturalized citizen, but he was also one of those very first people to be drafted in 1917. He was one of those first pick quotas that existed in World War I. Unfortunately, his service didn't last long. He was killed in the Ardennes in 1918. But I bring up Samuel and his family because it took them 8 years to find his remains on the battlefield. He was one of the very last soldiers to come home, coming home finally to St. Louis in 1926. And his father was so involved in not only trying to find Samuel's remains, but other families' remains, that this is one of the reasons that there was this movement to send out investigators to find American soldier remains in Europe in World War I. The gentleman on the right is Lieutenant Jerome Goldman. He too died in the war. He was, I think, the 18th St. Louisan that was killed in World War I. I bring him up because, unlike where Samuel Morgenstern, they couldn't find his remains, that was not the case with Jerome Goldman. And because of his family's position here with a major furniture company, and because people were really starting to realize at the time that this was going to have a huge impact on society, all of these young men going off and fighting and dying, that they closed Lindell and Olive Street for his funeral. And his funeral was held in the Mullah Temple with thousands and thousands of people in attendance. On a lighter side, after the war was over, the various entities around the US, including St. Louis, decided to have a United War Work campaign. And this was to raise money to help returning soldiers, to help the economy, to do all kinds of things to help everybody try to get back to some semblance of normalcy. So they had a one-day campaign where they wanted to see how much money that they could raise. And St. Louis, in that one day, raised $2.5 million, which for that time period was a lot of money. One of the things that happened was that they encouraged children, little boys and little girls, to also gather money and to donate it. And Estelle Engel, whose name is here, raised $1 and got to submit it to the War Work campaign, and therefore became a victory girl. I don't need to say, sorry? No, I don't think I need to say much about this building. I'm gonna try to hurry through this, I'm sorry. This is the Union Avenue Y. Everybody knows this building, also designed by Will Levy, and had a movie theater in it, a soda fountain. It was state of the art. The Jewish Hospital in St. Louis on Del Mar, also designed by Will Levy, and had its own surgery suite, which was highly unusual at the time. It lasted here for about 25 years before it had to be, before it moved on down to Kings Highway. This is the Preventorium, Camp Fifi, as most people knew it by. This was an anti-tuberculosis program that ran in St. Louis. The idea was to get kids out, to get them lots of good food and fresh air and plenty of sunshine, thus the little loincloths. The Jewish Orphans Home, lots and lots in this period of children who were labeled as orphans, even though they might have one parent living, but the parent felt that they could not actually provide for the child or children. The orphans home was on Oakland and Clayton, again near Forest Park, and it took them a long time to raise the money, but it was only one of the several orphanages for the Jewish community. This is the Ebenezer Lodge of the IOBB, and they too raised lots of money for both Jewish community institutions as well as larger St. Louis institutions. Rachel Stix-Michael became very much involved in social work, even though she certainly was a woman of means. During World War I, she saw so many people crippled that she started not only the Elias Michael School, but also the School for Crippled Children here in St. Louis. Lots of clubs and organizations. These are all at the Y. The young ladies up in the upper right are from a group called JUGS, Just Us Girls. And they started out as just a fun group, and then they decided that they needed to have something more important to do. So they also became part of fundraising and helping other institutions. Lots of cultural pursuits in St. Louis. The Jewish community was definitely involved in it. This is from a play called The Riddle of Isis, held at the Y. The Liberal Forum was a speakers platform run by the Y. Lasted about 70 years actually in St. Louis, and everybody who was anybody came. And what they meant by liberal was that you needed to have a wide range of topics as well as a wide range of opinions. Prominent journalists, politicians, Eleanor Roosevelt was a speaker, Frank Lloyd Wright was a speaker. Anybody who was anybody got to come in, and they would have these large fora for these speakers. The Fantastic Pickers, one of the music groups in the St. Louis area. This is from the Women's Council. The upper left is a performance that they did called The Dance of Death. And the other one is about women did a presentation portraying various academic areas. You can see history there, music. The woman with all the bugs are on her is natural science. Cabarets were very popular, especially at the Y. This happens to be the Half Pint Chorus for the Moulin Rouge annual fundraising event. And of course, the Jerusalem exhibit at the 1904 World's Fair. 11 acres just for this exhibition and more than 300 buildings. Lots of recreation. This is the time for camps to get started for the Jewish community. I love this picture because they're so funny looking. Wrestling, very popular at this time period. Women's athletics, they actually called this aesthetic dance for these young ladies. The back of it, it also calls them cute tricks, which is kind of insulting, but funny. The large group here is for a debate. And if we had groups like this for debates, that would be quite interesting, but not going to happen now. But you can see a very large crowd, men and women. Baseball was very popular here. This was one of the Wise teams that was a municipal champ in 1917. Lots of basketball. Basketball became very popular in the 1920s. And I leave you finally with a group that's not St. Louis, but made an impact on St. Louis. This is the Hakoah of Vienna soccer team. They came to St. Louis, a part of a world tour in 1926. 1,200 people attended the reception for them just at the Y, and a couple of days later, they played the St. Louis All-Stars, and they won 4-2. All right, that's it. I'm gonna stop sharing here if I can. There we go. Sorry, a little longer than I thought. Questions?
I think it was great. Thank you. If anyone would like to chat, they could type a question, they could raise their digital hand, or, you know, if you just unmute and ask a question.
Or whatever there, because I thought that's how Barbara's husband was, and maybe she
Alan?
couldn't relate to the bugs because it was
Yes.
just like her husband.
Can you hear me?
And some like a nutrient digs in the
Diane, can you hear me?
you know, and so if you type
Okay, fine. I was interested in what you're talking about. I think it was
what do you do with the kids?
United Hebrew Temple. I call it temple because I grew up in that congregation. Had a hard time, and they had to go to the Supreme Court to get approval to build where they built on Skinker.
Yes.
Many years later, Temple Israel had the same problem. Creve Coeur did not want them to come in. They have a huge area in Creve Coeur, and they had to go to the state Supreme Court, which ruled they could have a temple there.
Yeah,
So
that seemed to be a real problem. You know, we think that the St. Louis community is very open and welcoming, but there were lots of restrictions that existed for housing and opposition to building temples. Sometimes I think it was a matter of not wanting a large structure in their neighborhood, but I think that there was also, unfortunately, a lot of anti-Semitism that existed in the area, especially with the housing regulations. And I think that's why it had to all these cases went to before the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court.
Diane, Harriet Snyder says, Greensfelder, you referred to, isn't there something around Queenie Park in Baldwin with that name?
Oh.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Diane, can you?
Yeah, there is. They were very interesting people, the Greensfelders, and they obviously that farm didn't last for a long time, and the family, after the next generation came along, gave up the farm. But they themselves, Moses and Cary, were quite an interesting group.
Marcia, did you have a question? Mort, do you have a question?
Just a comment and a question that covers other religions as well. The Muslim community had a difficult time getting approval.
Yeah.
And I think maybe this past history explains why the Jewish community came out so strong in support of their being able to build.
I agree. Yeah.
One other brief comment was, I think earlier you mentioned that Bnei El was the oldest
No.
on this side of the Mississippi, and it really was United Hebrew in 1837, and Bnei El wasn't until 1852.
I meant a physical building that was their own. So,
okay.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily the earliest congregation for sure, but certainly the oldest physical building that was theirs, because up until then, everybody was meeting at a different location, borrowed space, or even in the very early times, meeting above a saloon or various things like that. But you're right, it was UH is the oldest congregation. Yeah.
Marcia, did you have a question? Okay, well, we have a question from Jeff. Diane is a treasure. I had the privilege of helping to bring her to our community at the suggestion of Dr. Archibald of the Missouri Historical Society. She has turned our archives into a beautiful repository. That's from Jeff. Jeff, did you want to continue saying anything about that?
Well, when we started the St. Louis Jewish Archives Committee,
There were some collections in the Federation building. It hadn't been worked on for years, and a lot of the things were decaying. And we started the archives committee around 2004, and finally raised enough money to bring in a part-time archivist. And I called Dr. Archibald because he had helped us work on a program on the Jewish community for the Missouri Historical Society, and which they have lost. For some reason, the software just disappeared.
Yeah.
And he recommended Diane. He said she just finished a project for us and she's wonderful. And as you all know now, she's turned our archives into something special. You can even find a lot of things online, and she's with the Holocaust Museum now. And we got to make you an honorary Jew, Diane.
Thank you. Well, it's actually, it's thanks to people like Jeff and many others that have supported the archives over the years, and not only through time, but money and collections. And I know that other people have comments, but I just want to say that the archives is only as good as the material that's given to it. So if you have items that you would like to have in a repository, keep us in mind. I am moving the archives to a temporary space until the new space is opened in a lower level of the new Holocaust Museum. We're combining the archives in the same space, although physically in the same physical space, but they will be kept separate from the Holocaust Museum archives. But it's been a real honor, and I have learned a lot from going through the archival material.
Barbara, she has said her grandfather arrived in 1897 and opened up a kosher meat market on North 7th Street, and then moved to the 11th and Franklin in the Irish section. I don't know if Barbara wants to say anything more about that, but...
So let me just say this to Barbara, is that one of my ongoing goals is to do a project on food and foodways in the Jewish community of St. Louis. And we were trying to get things done last year, and we're going to hopefully do something this year with the material that we had gathered. Unfortunately, the pandemic sort of stopped that, and then the move and everything else. We're actually still gathering material on that. So especially instances, we're trying to create a major database that lists all of the food-related businesses and industry that existed in St. Louis and the Jewish community, especially including photographs. So Barbara, if you've got images, let me know. I guess the center will have this presentation up, but if you don't have my contact information, I'm sure they can provide it for you. Yeah. So we'd love to have your stuff.
Harvey Schneider?
Yes, Diane, thank you for a very, very informative program. My question is, do you have any data on how quotas at the universities in St. Louis affected the Jewish community during this time?
I do not. I don't have any, but we have looked into that for some other people. Most of that information is held by the university archives, and they are, I know all of those archivists. We've talked about pulling together something about that. We've not done a lot on it. The main thing that we've done so far is through for professions like law and medicine, because those are things that researchers outside the area have actually approached us about. So those are the only things that we have any information about as far as the data about quotas, but certainly something to look into. Do you have a story related to that, Harvey, that we might?
I don't have any story, but we've heard stories about the existence of quotas, and I thought it would be interesting to know how they impacted the community.
Yeah, and as I said, I don't actually have any of that data, and I certainly don't have it in front of me right now, but we do have, when there's a woman who was doing a book about early Jewish women lawyers, and we found people that had sort of fallen away that nobody really knew about all the way back to the late 19th century in the St. Louis area who got their law degrees in at the universities here. We didn't actually look into the quotas, but we did know that there was a blowback, certainly not only Jewish students, but certainly women, obviously, at the time to go into those professions.
John Reichman, did you have a question? No. Mart, do you have another question?
Yeah, well, I just have a question in terms of when you talk about wanting to acquire things, like I have in a World's Fair collection of mine, the invitation to Dr. Tucholsky to come attend the opening ceremony.
Yeah.
And I wondered if that's something like would fit into the kind of things you have.
You bet it would. You bet. Yeah, absolutely. And I know that sometimes, especially, I mean, that's a unique artifact, a one-of-the-kind artifact. We would love to have those kind of things added to the archives. If they're personal images or personal family papers, we would be glad to scan them and give copies back to you if that's the way you would prefer it. But we are still gathering information. We talked even once many years ago about even opening not exactly a museum, but certainly a facility where some of these items could be on display. That's not worked out yet, but you know, I still have hope.
We have a couple of comments here, comments and questions from Sherry Terry. My grandparents had a shop on Easton Avenue for many years, and she has lots of photos that we'll share with you for a future project.
Excellent.
And then Harriet Snyder, she wants to know, were you aware of how United Hebrew and Tinker, when it was sold to the Missouri Historical Society, had discovered some beautiful frescoes underneath the paint on the ceiling when they were restoring?
I've heard about them. I've not actually seen any of the evidence of that, but certainly it's something that would be interesting to possibly work together with MoHist and do some sort of an exhibition or at least an online exhibit about those early images that were on the ceiling. I know that they've talked about even doing some more restoration up there. They've got one area in particular that has a leak in it that's constantly plaguing them. So I can check with those folks. They're good friends, so we can see what we can do. That'd be very interesting to share that information.
We have two more. Lot Silverstein wanted to know, do you know when did Brown Shoe start?
I don't know the exact date off the top of my head, and I have actually hounded certain people who used to work for them to share their information that they have about them, to no avail, at least yet. I do have one small file on both Brown and Edison Brothers shoes, but not a whole lot of information. Do you have any?
He didn't respond, so I don't know if he's still with us or not. But so then the last question I have here was from Alice, and she would like to know, why weren't the Orthodox and conservative synagogues mentioned in the presentation?
Because we don't have photographs. This book, the way Arcadia Press does, is that this particular type of publication that they do has to have photographs in it. And unfortunately, most of the Orthodox groups do not share their photographs. I just have very few of them. I have publications, a few publications. I have some things, various speakers and things like that, but no photographs. And if you all know of any and have contacts with anybody who might have those kind of things, please share, because we would like to make it more inclusive. Absolutely. There are some Orthodox items that are in the book. I just didn't add them to the presentation today.
Okay, one more question. John Rickman.
Yes, my grandfather was the editor of the Jewish Record, and there was a lot of material that was at one time given to the archives. It's my understanding that a lot of the newspaper has disintegrated, and
yes,
you were not able to maintain it. Do you have that material? And I can contact my relatives to see if they still have anything, but I think it was pretty much given to the archives.
So when I first got there to the archives, there were bound volumes from the paper, from the record. Not a lot of them, at least not when I got there. Unfortunately, they had been stored inadequately. And as you turned pages, they literally crumbled in your hands, which was a real shame. There are some of those that I know of that have been from elsewhere, were scanned and digitized, and that are available on microfilm. And I believe that the Media Archives at the Hebrew Union College has some of that is actually available. I have a few other things from the record, especially advertising information that came down, but I don't have any, I have very few physical items left. So if the family has any of that stuff, we'd be honored. And now that we're actually going to have climate control and environmental controls in the new facility, it will be fabulous. We did not have that. We did the best we could in the location that we had it, but the new facilities will be much better for that.
Great.
Diane, this was a wonderful program. We've had a lot of comments. Thank you so much for the wonderful program. And Stephen, did you have anything you would like to add? You have to unmute.
I just want to add my appreciation and that of everyone who's participated today for a really interesting and enlightening talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Diane.
Can you hear me? Hello. I'm in Kansas City watching this, and I started a few minutes late, and I have so many friends with St. Louis heritage and know people in St. Louis. Are you going to show this again? Is there a way of getting this again? It was most interesting, and I'm jealous.
Actually,
Kansas City.
Actually, I did record it today, Arlene, and it will be on our website, and we can send that link to you so that you can see the whole thing.
Okay. So just get on the Meyerowitz. I don't even know how I got on your emails, but awesome.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you, Diane. We will end our program for now, and much appreciation.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Have a good day. Bye.